Hey, welcome back. We're at our Bible study of the Gospel of Matthew at Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Spring Lake Park, Minnesota. We continue with this service. We don't know how things are going out in the world, and things are going up or going down, but we'll continue with streaming our Bible study and hope that you will continue to join us in that study. Certainly we can continue to remain in the Word of God through all the challenges and all the troubles that are faced by the world at the present time. And it's wonderful that we can do so within this format. So I hope it will be a blessing to you today as we dive in once again to the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And we are in Matthew chapter 27, verse 33. We're up to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. A little bit about crucifixion. All sorts of things are said about crucifixions, but the reason a person died when they were crucified was because they suffocated. They suffocated to death, and the reason they suffocated to death is that they became so tired that they couldn't lift up their body cavity to take in a breath, and so it was a slow suffocation, sometimes over days. It would take days for people to die. It was a very gruesome and horrible way to be executed. And the reason it was done by the Romans was because they didn't have a big enough army to have people stationed everywhere throughout the empire. So they needed ways to terrorize people. And one of the ways they did was through crucifixion and reminding people if they had to come and take care of a problem, it wasn't just going to be a quick end. It was going to be a gruesome and terrible and horrible end. It's an interesting idea, isn't it? The idea that if someone will risk something, quick instant death. But if they're faced with a long, gruesome one, And so, the effect of the crucifixion of Christ. It's not just simply something like Christ being shot, or Christ being hung, or Christ falling off a cliff, which is what they used to do in Rome. If someone in the upper echelons had committed a crime deserving death, they'd toss him off a hill. That was seen to be the best way and the most humane way. The worst way was crucifixion, because it could go on for days. So, with that in mind, we can talk about the crucifixion of Christ. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall. And after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. We don't know what Golgotha, place of the skull, actually signifies. Is it a place where there were lots of skulls? Because crucifixions took place there frequently, and they just leave the bodies there? And then over time, you just have a pile of skulls there? You say, well, that's kind of strange, Pastor, that maybe couldn't be it. Well, oddly enough, in Cambodia today, because of the Khmer Rouge, the party that went and murdered systematically, they say 2 to 3 million people after the Vietnam War. So many people were killed that their bodies were just left out in fields all over Cambodia. And what was happening, oddly enough, was that the cattle started to eat the bones. And so they had this movement a few years ago to gather up all the skulls and the bones and put them in houses all over Cambodia. And so just to save them. And so today there are all these places where there are these houses they're just full of bones. And you're saying, oh, that's really gruesome, Pastor. It's Sunday morning, and I haven't had my donut yet. Well, keep working on that donut. Another example, if you go to France, and I haven't been there, but I've seen pictures. A friend of mine went. And there's a couple of places in France where you can go, and they have thousands and thousands and thousands of skeletal remains of soldiers from World War I in gigantic piles. And you can, in the one place, you walk over the top of them and look down through a glass, and the pile apparently is something like 100 or 200 yards long. And because there was no way to identify all the remains on the battlefield because it was just horrific, and thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people were killed. So what they did was they took the bones and they put them all in a huge pile in one place. And in another place, they divided, they kind of took the areas and they said, well, this is where the British were, and this is where the French were, and this is where the Germans were. And so they labeled the piles. And you can still go there today and see all of that. All of the skulls and bodies, bones laying there. You can do that. Not many people do, but according to my friend who went, it was a very sobering experience, seeing all of that. So indeed, Golgotha could refer to the idea that just around that area there were just bones and skulls and that sort of thing from the previous crucifixions that had gone on. Now, if you remember Ben-Hur, which I always liked when I was a kid, not simply because it was such an awesome looking movie and it had some great scenes in it, but my parents allowed me to stay up to watch it since it was semi-religious because Jesus was in it. And so I got to stay up till 10 o'clock, but I don't think I ever made it to the end of the film. I think I always woke up in my bed the next morning. But at the end of the film, which I don't think I saw until I was an adult, when Jesus is being crucified there, the lightning flashes, and if you look really quickly, it looks like a skull. The hill that he's on, it kind of looks like a skull. I think they had the similar thing in Pirates of the Caribbean or something like that. Was it Pirates of the Caribbean? Yeah. And they stole that from Ben-Hur. Man, what's with that? But anyway, I would think the first example would probably be more to the point. When Billy Graham's in-laws, so he married, I forget what her name is, Ruth something. Was it Ruth something? But her parents were medical missionaries to China in the 1920s. And a book was written about them called Foreign Devil in China. And I read that book when I was in high school. It's a small book, and it was very influential upon me. But they would drive into a city in those 1920s, 1930s cars, and they still would have people's heads on spears outside of the cities in the 1920s and 1930s in China. Criminals who had been executed. And then they'd be put on display to remind everyone, don't do this. So I tend to think it's probably more the first than the second idea. But we don't know. We just know it's called Golgotha, place of the skull. All right? Those are our two ideas. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garment. Now, that doesn't mean, notice, this is a weird thing about verbs, okay? We can talk about a verb that talks about an action in the past that is completed and is done with, okay? And so something happened in the past. Here's past. Here's present. And here is future. And our verbs, strangely enough, can talk about the past in a very interesting way. They can talk about something that was past that's done with, like he died. Now, he died at a certain point. He died in 1842. Okay, we got that. But we also have this idea with verbs that something has happened in the past and it continues on to the present day. So it happened in the past and it's continuing to the present day. And that's kind of what we have with the term crucified. After they had crucified him, it doesn't mean that once everything was done with the crucifixion and he had been taken down off the cross and he was in the grave, then they did this. No, meaning he was crucified and he was continuing to be crucified. Okay? This term is referring to the actual placing of Jesus on the cross. And he was continuing to suffer the crucifixion. And in Greek, they make that distinction with verb forms, perfect, imperfect. In Latin, they have something called a pluperfect. And then we have present and we have future tenses. We have optatives and all sorts of different types of verb forms. And that's how we know how to translate. It's kind of cool that we can make a very accurate translation from Greek simply because the verbs are so definitive as far as what they say about action. What they say about, there's something also called the aorist, which is used a lot. Oh yeah, I like taking Greek. It was enjoyable. It was a good workout for the brain. I didn't know anything about it. I probably still don't. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. Why would they do that? Why wouldn't they take it to Goodwill? Why wouldn't they just throw it away? Why wouldn't they take it out to their shops and use it? Because remember, there were no weaving machines in the day, and the garments that you had were very valuable, and they were hand-woven garments, and handmade. Person died, you don't just bury their clothing with them. You take it, a valuable thing. And it doesn't give us the details that some of the other Gospels do. For Matthew, this isn't the important point. And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. So they put Jesus on the cross, and how high was he up in the air? All he had to do was to be off the ground. He didn't have to be 5 feet off the ground or 10 feet off the ground. All he had to do was have his feet off the ground. That's all that needed to be done. And then they sat down to watch, to see what would happen. It's kind of a gruesome idea, isn't it? That, you start an execution and then you just sit and watch. But I guess you have nothing else to do. And you say to yourself, wow, those people back then, man, they were horrid. Well, shall we talk horror movies? Where people pay $10 to $20 to sit and watch all manner of horrible things happen to people? And they pay to do it? And then maybe they'll watch a series of them in a row on binge watch horror films. Boy, I certainly wouldn't want to talk to a person after they'd done that. Who knows what kind of shape they'd be in. But people today still do that. And they don't mind watching horrific things go on. I mean, it's why is that? Are we fascinated by that? Could be. Stinks for them. And anyway, it's not the same. Those are just actors and actresses, and they're not really hurt. And they're not, oh really? You don't think seeing that image of people dying in such horrific ways doesn't affect you? If you've ever had a little kid and they have snuck and watched something on television they shouldn't have watched, and then had nightmares for the next 3 nights, 4 nights, yeah, it's not a simple thing. And above his head they put up the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Remember, we had that whole discussion in another gospel about that. But here it's just said, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." A matter of fact. Interesting. At that time, 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. As long as we're getting the soldiers out, as long as we're getting the crosses out, because there's all sorts of speculation about this. Did they use the same post and then just had them carry their cross member up with them? Some say that's probably what happened. Did they actually use the same cross again and again and again? Probably so. It's not like they could go to Home Depot or go to Menards and pick up another 6x6 and do this again and again and again. I mean, I saw a Roman ship. Strangely enough, there's a Roman ship museum in Mainz, Germany. And the reason there's a Roman ship museum in Mainz, Germany is when they were doing something in the city, they're right on the Main River, they found 3 Roman ships when they were digging into the river, because that used to be where the Romans were. And of course, there was a house there for some special Roman guy, and governor, an officer. But they found the 3 ships, and then they found his house too, which was really cool. And you can go see it. But consequently, they have a shipbuilding museum there now where they make copies of Roman ships and then sell them to museums around the world. That's what they do. And you can go see it. It's right close to the train station when you get into Mainz. And it's only like €3 to get in. It's worth the trip. And they have actually people who had been arrested and put in prison working there to learn new skills. But the reason I bring this up, yes, Pastor, why did you bring this up? Is because the bottom of the ship, and I used to know all these ship terms. I don't know them this morning. Here's the hull, but on the very bottom of the ship, to get that for the ship, what they would do is they'd look for a tree that had branches like this. And then they would cut the branches right. And then they would saw the wood out right here to get the piece of wood that had the grain in it like that. Just think how long it took them to do that by hand. So, I'm thinking when it comes to the crucifixion that they didn't waste their efforts when it came to making crosses, and they would reuse the crosses that they had constructed for that purpose. And you're going to have a crucifixion. The soldiers are there. People are there. Let's do 3. Let's not do 1. There were instances of the Romans crucifying dozens and even hundreds at a time. Yeah. Those passing by were hurling abuse at them, abusing at him, wagging their heads. It's kind of a weird term, wagging the head. But we've seen people do it. And we've seen, when you see some, well, you think you're so. Maybe it has to do with maybe a conversation in your family at Christmas time or something. Or Thanksgiving after everybody's had something to eat and old hurts come out, and then you have a lot of head wagging that takes place. So it seems. But that's what that's about. They're wagging their heads. Wow. Okay? Hurling abuse at him and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Now it's interesting, the abuse has to do with the resurrection. The abuse has to do with the fact that he's the Son of God. The abuse doesn't have to do with the fact that he's a Galilean, or that he's from Nazareth, or he walked on water, or he fed the 5,000, or you who raised so many people from the dead. No, it has specifically to do with the assertions he made about himself, that he was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And we know from the posting of the guards by the leaders of the Jews, I think that's in the Gospel of Mark, that they knew he was talking about his resurrection. But of course, you might as well let the crowds think that he was talking about the temple, right? Let them think that, and let them accomplish your purposes for you. If you are the Son of God, so, the quote, "You are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Same way the chief priest also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, "Oh, he saved others, can't save himself. If he is the king of Israel." Now that's interesting, because that's the thing they didn't want him to be. They did not want him to be the king of Israel, and they were frightened that he actually was the king of Israel. Just like, remember Herod? He was so frightened, Herod the Great. Where is he born king of the Jews? Oh, we don't need another king. I'm Herod the Great. I don't need someone who's competing for power with me. Let him now come down from the cross, and we'll believe in him. It's an interesting thing. If he had come down off the cross, would they have? It's the old parable, right, that Jesus tells. If they don't believe the law and the prophets, they're not going to believe even if someone were to rise from the dead. And of course, the Gospel of John tells us what? The Gospel of John tells us that shortly before this, what had Jesus done? He had raised Lazarus from the dead, right outside of Jerusalem. And what had the leaders of the Jews then plotted to do? Because Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. To kill Lazarus along with Jesus. So if Jesus had come down off the cross, chances are they wouldn't have believed in him either. Because ultimately, they're not going to believe in him at all. Because they have their power, they have their position, and they're not going to give it up. It's kind of like at the end of World War II, where you have Mussolini. He gets executed and dragged around his town there. And you say to yourself, the end is near. Hitler's sitting there in Berlin, and you've got the Russians coming in from the east, you've got the Allies coming in from the west. Why don't they just raise the flag and say, okay, we're good? No, he's not going to give up to the bitter end, and then of course he commits suicide. That's these people, right? We're not going to believe. Just not going to believe. Interesting. He's the king of Israel. Let him come now. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now. If he delights in him, for he said, I am the Son of God. I mean, that's really, 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 really cruel. Really cruel. Really horrific. Well, it's almost like they're completely detached from God, aren't they? And completely, they see the temple, they see Israel, they see Pharisaical Judaism, they see the law of Moses merely as a means to an end. Merely as a means to an end. Kind of like when I was when I went to college and I was studying music, and I also studied classical languages, thus the joke earlier. But I was studying music, and I just love music. I love all sorts of music, and I wouldn't have studied it had I not loved it. But I was so surprised to meet people who were so talented musically, who had no love for music. Yes, they had a talent. Yes, they could sing, they could play, they could do whatever, and a lot of times better than anyone in the music department. But they had no interest in it. They had no interest in it whatsoever. For them, it was a means to an end. That was it. And there's plenty of situations like that in the world, where people have no interest in what they're doing, but they do it just because they need to make a buck. Or they do it because they've kind of fallen into it, and it works for them, and it creates a living. This is the chief priests and the elders. And then saying of Jesus, well, if he trusts in God, let God deliver. He said he's God's son. Let God deliver him. I mean, there's a lot going on there, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah, we have a question. Who has the authority to kill another human? The fifth commandment says, you shall not murder, but we have capital punishment from trials and also law enforcement that is allowed to kill civilians. As Christians, how do we respond to this?
Okay. Well, look at the time. Well, we can go to Romans, right? We can go to Romans 13. And it's an interesting chapter there. Romans 13. Okay. Every person, this is Romans 13:1. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinances of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what's good, and you'll have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. want to cross that out. Traditionally, the Lutheran position has been, and the Christian position has been, that the government does have the right to punish evil, and punish evil with death. Now, should they do so unjustly? Should they do so arbitrarily? Should they do so without proper No, of course not. Should they be abusive? No. Should they be corrupt? No. That's not the issue. It's just like in theology. That person is teaching falsely about the Holy Spirit. Well, I've got an idea. Let's just not teach about the Holy Spirit ever again. And that way, we don't need to worry about someone teaching falsely about it. Okay, well, that person's teaching falsely about the Father. Oh, let's have a solution. Let's not teach about the Father ever again. Then we won't have to deal with anyone who teaches falsely about it. How about parents? Those parents are abusive. Well, let's do this. Let's get rid of parents, because parenting and parents can be abusive and also often are. They're not good parents. They're lousy parents. So let's just get rid of parents. Well, no. Let's help the parents who are struggling, and let's teach parents how to parent effectively so they don't have to be abusive, nor do they fall into abuse. And same thing here. Do we need reform, and do we need to put a microscope on the police department and a magnifying glass to see what's? Of course we do. Sure. Same thing with government. Always. But does that mean that we need to get rid of government and get rid of a way to control evil among us? I mean, certainly we can be open to all sorts of different ways to do that, and that's kind of what they're exploring right now, which is interesting, because in different countries in the world, they do it in different ways. Okay, have that discussion. But the idea that government exists, we can't be anti-government, and we can't even be anti-authority. We do have to be against the abuse of authority and the abuse by government. Okay? And we have to make that distinction. And so it's... and here, the connection between murder, for example, and war. You know, if you read the book, and we worked on that book, can a soldier, can a Christian be a soldier? Luther wrote a book on that, because the idea, soldiers were coming to him and saying, you know what, we don't like doing what we're doing, and Luther said, look. If you don't like it, then don't do it. But if you have to do it, here's the deal. You have to be responsible for what you're doing. It's a complex mess. But Scripture talks about government being installed by God for our blessing. It doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean there's no perfect government in the world. And there's never going to be a perfect government in the world until Jesus is king. If you want to know what it's like not to have a government or to have little government, get on a plane and fly over to Africa. Go to Nigeria. Wander around there for a while and see what it's like not to have a government, not to have an effective government, and to have an abusive government. It's a horrific thing. So, we're not against authority, and we're not against government, but we are against the abuse of authority, and we are against the abuse of government. And can policing take place in a variety of ways? Sure, most definitely can. But are there always going to be people who are going to use force to do deadly things? Yes, there are. But we meet that force, and then we don't abuse it. We don't abuse the usage of force. I know it's a raw time right now. It's a difficult time, and I don't mean to offend anyone. You take a look at Romans. You take a look at Romans there. It is interesting that Paul doesn't talk a lot about any of this stuff, right? He talks about that. But should and can we do this? Yeah, we can. And I think we should. So, yeah. But it's the question that comes up in Luther's book. And, it's available on Lutheran Press website, and I'm not making a push here. You can get it downloaded for free and read it. I mean, I don't need your $5. Okay? Keep your $5. let's say somebody invades my home. Let's make it even better. Let's say make it 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I have 2 beautiful teenage daughters, 4 sons, beautiful wife. Someone comes into my home and wants to rape my children and kill the other ones. And I'm there, and I say, well, I'm a Christian. I can't do anything about that. Well, what Luther says is this: no, you defend your family. You defend your family, but you're not defending them even using deadly force, because you're frightened individually that you're going to die, or you're frightened, you're doing this out of fear. You're doing it to defend your neighbor. And so when soldiers work for us, they're not murdering, they're not killing for themselves. It's for us. And if the police are functioning correctly, the same thing occurs. Should they abuse their? No. Let's just call it what it is, abuse. Just like we call parental abuse. Okay? But we don't call it, let's get rid of parents. We don't say, let's get rid of parents. Okay, so someone forced the issue. Someone threw out the hand. And now I'll drink my tea, and we can have further discussion. Any other questions off that? No other questions? Okay. All right. The robbers who had been crucified with him were also insulting him with the same words. Oh, that was tough. Now from the 6th hour fell upon the land until the 9th hour. What is that, 12 to 3? About the 9th hour, Jesus cries out with a loud voice. Darkness, 3 hours. Significant? I would think so. About the 9th hour, you can't get that in the movie, right? You go to a 2-hour movie, you can't put the 3 hours of darkness in there. Just think, okay, it's a 5-hour movie because we got to put the 3 hours of darkness in there. But how effective would that be? That would be an interesting theatrical experience as well, where you go to witness the crucifixion of Jesus on a stage, and as part of that witnessing of the crucifixion of Jesus on a stage, you all have to sit there in the dark and look at it for 3 hours in darkness. That's interesting. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now it's interesting, that's in here. It's kind of a nod to the whole situation we talked about last week between Greek and Aramaic and Latin, right? The Roman soldiers speaking Latin, speaking Greek, the locals speaking Aramaic, but also Greek. Jesus crying out in Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. But then the writer of the Gospel of Matthew translating that for the reader. But it's interesting. We don't have that really in other places where we have Jesus' words translated. So does that mean he spoke Aramaic and then the writer of the Gospels just wrote it in Greek? Or did Jesus basically function in Greek? It's kind of an interesting idea, because what you have at that time is you still have a great influence of Greek upon the region. So here's our excellent diagram. This is the Mediterranean. Here we have Galilee. Here we have Samaria. Here we have Judea proper, right? This is all the Tetrarchy. I think it went out this way too, all right? And so then you have Jerusalem about right here. And you have Galilee in this area. Jesus is from this area. And you have the Sea of Galilee here. like Mille Lacs Lake here in Minnesota. You have the Jordan River, and then the Dead Sea down in this region right here. But this whole area right in here was influenced culturally by Greek. And so even and they showed that in the Gospel of John movie, where Jesus is sent over to the head of one of the Herods, the head of Galilee at the time. And do you remember that? He's got curly hair, curly greased hair. He looks like a Greek statue. And we know that he was a Hellenist. A Hellenist. People who like Helen. No. He was a Hellenist, meaning he really liked Greece and the Greek culture. Kind of like today, we have north of here what's called the Cowboy Church. That just still kills me, the Cowboy Church. I suppose you wear hats and boots and big belt buckles, and when you come in the morning, you say, "Howdy, partner," and they say, "Howdy, partner," and off you go. It's the Cowboy Church. Now, the thing that makes this funny, of course, is that you're saying our church is going to have a very specific culture, and that culture is going to be the culture of the cowboy. Okay. Well, when we run into Hellenist culture, that means it's just a fancy way of saying Greek. So, could Jesus have spoken and learned and did everything in Greek as well as Aramaic? Sure. Yeah, you bet. And because he comes from the region where it really was popular at that time. And of course, at that time, Greek thought was considered still to be superior to any other thought. The Romans were just a big army and organizers, really good at organizing and really good at setting up, building things. Architects, they could build stuff. What do the Romans give to the world that's still long-lasting today? Many things, but probably one of the most basic things that they gave the world is cement or concrete. They figured out how to use it, and they figured out how to build things with it, and they figured out how to construct arches using it, and many of them that still stand today. And the buildings we have today, and the streets, and our building methods. So many of them we owe to the Romans, who really perfected it. Got a book in my library just on Roman bricks. I know. Somebody gave it to me. I didn't buy it. Somebody gave it to me, right? But there were like all sorts of different bricks that they built or made, and then it's amazing. But without cement, how could they have done what they did? Build the roads, and because an army would run across a river, and they would destroy the way they got across the river, and the Romans would say, no problem, we'll take a week and we'll build a bridge, and we'll come after you, and that's what they did. But whether you'd want to buy something made in Italy today, it's another question. That's a big question. Now, from the 6th hour, let's see. And so that's all from Eli Eli Lama Sabachthani. And some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, began saying, "The man is calling for Elijah." Why? Why would he be calling for Elijah? Why not Moses? Why not Isaiah the prophet? Why not Daniel? Why not Abraham? Why does he pick Elijah? Don't see any hands. Don't see any hands. Elijah's the one that went up into heaven, right? He's the one that doesn't die. And the whole idea, and the Old Testament ends with that idea, right? The Old Testament ends with the idea that before the Messiah comes, Elijah will appear, right? And then with that whole discussion with John the Baptist, are you Elijah? The Elijah who is to come. And Jesus said, yeah, that's who he is. And John said, I'm not Elijah. I'm not Elijah that came down from heaven. But Jesus does identify John the Baptist as the Elijah who is to come. Now, the Jews today still expect Elijah to appear. Elijah to appear. And I don't even know if I want to talk about this. I went on a synagogue website once, and they have a synagogue youth group, and they did a musical about the Passover. And they adopted all the Passover liturgies to famous musical melodies. It's there. You can Google it. And the one for Elijah was something like this, from West Side Story. Yes, it is. They weren't going like this. Elijah, I just saw a man named Elijah. And off it went. You can Google it. Passover musical, and they adopted everything to Broadway numbers. Okay. So, he's crying for Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink. They didn't have those squeeze bottles back then. And, you put water in a sponge and you can suck on a sponge. It's weird. They do that in hospitals now, right? Especially for the elderly. If they need to have a drink and they can't drink, they take a stick and they stick it on a little sponge, a little starry, orangey sponge, and they stick it in the water, and then they dab the person's mouth with that. We still do that today. That's interesting. Okay, that's good for this week. Hope you can join us again next week. We are having a Bible study after the worship service this morning, and hope you can join us for the worship service and then join us for the Bible study.